Judge fines man for speeding. Daughter says, Dad's much worse. The entire courtroom gasps. It was just a routine morning in court, the type of day where you'd expect a few fines, maybe some stern lectures, and everyone moving on with their lives. That's what everyone thought, until the judge called the next case. The room was quiet, the air thick with the usual tension of people hoping to get off lightly. But no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what was about to unfold as the judge adjusted his glasses and glanced at the paperwork in front of him. He announced the name, Mr. Greg Hartman. A middle-aged man with a sheepish grin and graying hair stepped forward, wearing the usual "I've been caught" expression that everyone in traffic court tends to have. His daughter, a girl no older than 13, stood beside him, arms crossed, and clearly not thrilled to be there. You could almost feel her teenage embarrassment radiating across the room. Greg was there for a speeding ticket, a fairly standard case. The officer had clocked him going a solid 20 miles per hour over the limit, and it seemed like an open and shut situation. But from the moment Greg began to speak, things started to shift. "I'm not proud of it, Your Honor," Greg said, his voice carrying the hint of a practiced excuse. "I was just in a hurry to get my daughter to school on time. It wasn't reckless or anything, just poor timing." The judge nodded, already looking bored, ready to issue a fine and move on. But then, from the corner of the courtroom, a small voice spoke up. "That's not true, Dad," the daughter said, her voice soft but firm. The room went silent. Greg's head snapped towards her, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and panic. He hadn't expected her to say a word, let alone call him out in front of a judge. For a split second, everyone in the courtroom held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The judge, curious now, leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone careful. "Young lady, would you care to clarify?" Greg shifted uncomfortably on his feet. But his daughter, her eyes locked on the judge, didn't flinch. "Dad's much worse than what he's saying. He's always speeding. He does it all the time." The courtroom erupted in a low murmur, shocked whispers, bouncing around as people exchanged glances. Greg looked like he wanted to sink into the floor, his face flushing with embarrassment. The judge raised his hand to silence the room, but there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. He was no longer treating this like just another speeding case. "Is that true, Mr. Hartman?" the judge asked, his voice measured, but with an edge of suspicion now. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, his daughter continued. "And it's not just speeding. Sometimes he drives. After drinking." Her voice trailed off, but the impact of her words hit the courtroom like a hammer. Gasps echoed across the room, and even the judge's usually composed expression faltered. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Greg, waiting for an explanation that now seemed impossible to give. Greg's face had gone pale. He stumbled over his words, trying to grasp for a defense, but there was nothing he could say that would erase what his daughter had just revealed. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that makes your heart race. Even though you're not the one on trial, the judge looked between father and daughter, clearly grappling with how to proceed. What had started as a simple speeding case had suddenly turned into something far more serious. The entire courtroom was on edge, hanging on the judge's next words. "I think we need to discuss this further," the judge finally said, his tone much more serious than it had been just moments ago. "Mr. Hartman, I'm afraid your case isn't as straightforward as you made it seem." Greg swallowed hard, knowing full well what this meant. His daughter, meanwhile, stood by his side, no longer embarrassed, but looking determined, as if this was her chance to finally say something that had been weighing on her for a long time. And just like that, what started as a simple speeding ticket had spiraled into a courtroom drama that no one had seen coming. Everyone in the room was waiting to see what the judge would do next. Would Greg face more than just a fine? Would there be more to uncover about his reckless behavior? But before anyone could find out, the judge took a deep breath and adjourned the court for a short recess. As the room buzzed with speculation and whispered conversations, Greg sat down heavily in his seat, staring straight ahead, his mind racing. His daughter sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, looking strangely calm, given the chaos her words had just unleashed. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew exactly what. As the courtroom filled with nervous energy, Greg sat in silence, staring at the floor. His mind raced through every possible scenario, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't come up with a way out of the mess he was in. His daughter had opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through, and now there was no going back. She sat quietly beside him, her face expressionless, as if she hadn't just changed everything with a few simple words. The recess dragged on, and whispers floated around the room as people speculated about what might happen next. Some felt bad for Greg. Others were already passing judgment. Everyone had an opinion, but no one knew the full story, not yet at least. Greg leaned over to his daughter, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you say that?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration and fear. She didn't look at him. "Because it's true, Dad," she said, her voice calm. "You need to stop lying. You're putting people in danger." Greg sat back in his seat, the weight of her words sinking in. He couldn't deny it anymore, not after she'd said it in front of everyone. The truth was, he'd been reckless for a long time, always making excuses, always thinking he could get away with it. But now, it was all out in the open. And the worst part? His own daughter was the one who exposed him. The judge returned, and the room fell silent again. Greg could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him as the judge took his seat, his expression serious. "Mr. Hartman," the judge began, "we need to address what's been brought up here. This isn't just about speeding anymore. If what your daughter says is true, we're dealing with a much bigger issue." Greg swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the judge continued. "Driving under the influence is a serious crime. It puts lives at risk. Your own, your daughter's, and everyone else on the road. This court takes that very seriously. So, I'm giving you one chance to come clean. Is there more to this than what you've told us?" Greg hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced at his daughter, her face still unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she was done protecting him. She wasn't going to help him lie his way out of this. His heart pounded as he took a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor," Greg finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "I've made some bad choices. I've driven after drinking a few times. I never meant to hurt anyone, but I see now how dangerous it was." The room was so quiet. You could hear a pin drop. Greg's confession hung in the air, the full weight of his words settling over the courtroom. He'd finally admitted it. Everything his daughter had said was true. The judge didn't respond right away, letting the silence linger as he studied Greg, weighing his next move. Greg's daughter glanced at him, her expression softening for the first time since they entered the courtroom. She'd said her piece, and now it was up to the judge to decide what came next. But the tension wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman who had remained quiet during the earlier testimony, stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Given Mr. Hartman's admission, I believe we need to investigate these incidents further. It's possible that this isn't just a matter of a few bad decisions. There could be a pattern of reckless behavior here, and we owe it to the public to look into it. Greg felt his stomach drop. A formal investigation, that meant more than just a fine or a scolding from the judge. It meant digging into his past, bringing up every mistake, every moment of poor judgment, and laying it bare for everyone to see. He'd thought things couldn't get worse, but they just had. The judge nodded thoughtfully, clearly considering the prosecutor's words. "That's a fair point," he said slowly. "Mr. Hartman, this may require further legal action beyond today's case. However, I'm also aware that this is a turning point for you. The fact that you've admitted your mistakes is not lost on me." The judge's words offered a small glimmer of hope, but Greg knew it wasn't enough to erase the damage that had already been done. The prosecutor's suggestion of an investigation loomed over him like a storm cloud, threatening to upend his life even further. And then, the judge turned his attention to Greg's daughter. "Young lady," he said gently, "I want to commend you for your bravery today. It's not easy to speak up, especially in front of so many people, and especially about someone you care about. But you've done something important. Your honesty may very well save lives." Greg's daughter nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and resolve. For her, this wasn't about punishing her father. It was about making sure he understood the consequences of his actions. The judge leaned back, his decision looming. "We'll take a short recess to review everything that's been said here today," he announced, standing up and signaling the end of the session for now. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Greg sat in stunned silence, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. His world was unraveling, and there was no clear path forward. His daughter sat beside him, quiet but calm, her shoulders a little less tense than they had been before. These walls felt like they were closing in. His mistakes, his lies, all the things he thought he could hide were catching up with him, and now the whole world would know. What would come next? Would the judge show mercy? Would the prosecutor dig up even more dirt on him? Greg didn't know the answers. All he knew was that the story wasn't over. Not yet. As Greg sat there in silence, the walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in. The recess was dragging on, but each passing minute felt like an eternity. His mind raced through everything that had happened: the speeding ticket, his daughter's unexpected confession, the judge's serious tone, and now the looming threat of an investigation. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear: his life was no longer in his control. His daughter sat quietly beside him, and for the first time in a long time, Greg really looked at her. She was just a kid, but she had shown more strength and honesty today than he ever had. The realization hit him hard. He had been reckless, not just on the road, but in how he had lived his life. He had put himself and others at risk, and worst of all, he had put his daughter in a position where she felt like she had to call him out in public just to get him to face the truth. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and everyone in the courtroom turned to see him walk back to his seat. The judge's expression was unreadable, his face calm but serious. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the verdict. "Mr. Hartman," the judge began, "I've reviewed everything that's been said today, and I believe we need to take this seriously. You've admitted to dangerous behavior, driving under the influence, and that's not something this court can ignore." Greg's stomach dropped. He braced himself for the worst, knowing he had little room for hope. His daughter's words played over and over in his head. This was it, the moment everything would come crashing down. But The judge continued, and Greg's breath caught in his throat. I also see that today may be a turning point for you. Your daughter's bravery in speaking up has given us insight into something deeper. You've acknowledged your mistakes, and while that doesn't erase the danger you've caused, it shows that you're ready to face the consequences. Greg's eyes flicked to his daughter, who was watching the judge intently. Her face remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, maybe relief or hope, that told Greg this wasn't the end of the road. There was still a chance for change. I'm going to impose a fine for the speeding violation, the judge said, his voice steady. But as for the more serious issue of driving under the influence, I'm ordering you to attend a mandatory rehabilitation program. This will include counseling and community service, where you will work directly with victims of reckless driving. This is your opportunity to make things right, Mr. Hartman. Don't waste it. Greg nodded, overwhelmed but grateful. It wasn't the punishment he had feared. It was a chance to turn his life around, to prove to his daughter and to himself that he could be better. The judge looked at Greg's daughter next, his expression softening. And as for you, young lady, he said, you've done something incredibly important today. You've shown courage and maturity beyond your years, and I hope you know how valuable that is. You've helped your father more than you know. She smiled faintly, her eyes finally meeting her father's. For the first time that day, Greg felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't just getting a second chance. He was being given a path forward, one where he could finally be the kind of father his daughter deserved. As the judge wrapped up the case, the courtroom began to empty. Greg stood up slowly, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. But as he turned to his daughter, he saw her standing there, waiting for him. She hadn't abandoned him, even after everything that had come out. In that moment, Greg realized that the road ahead wasn't just about fixing his own mistakes. It was about rebuilding the trust between them. They walked out of the courtroom together, the weight of the day still heavy, but with a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Greg knew it wouldn't be easy. He had a lot of work to do, not just in the program, but in his life. He needed to show his daughter that he could change, that he could be the father she needed him to be. As they stepped outside into the crisp air, Greg looked at his daughter. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. I'm going to do better, I promise. She looked up at him, her expression softening. I know, Dad, she said. That's why I spoke up. I knew you could be better. Greg smiled, a small but genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a real chance to turn things around. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least now, he wasn't walking it alone. As they headed toward the car, Greg took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was ready to face it, ready to do the work. And with his daughter by his side, he knew he could. The courtroom drama had ended. But for Greg, a new chapter was just beginning, one filled with challenges, yes, but also with the promise of redemption and growth.